I always find it funny when people accuse me of hating this country and its culture and its people. Because one, I'm f***ing here, ain't I? And two, there is no other country on this earth which could make somebody as obnoxious as me. Only Britain could do it. And I love this country's culture and history. I did English literature, for f***'s sake. You don't do that unless you really like something about it. And the things that I've always loved most about this country are the ways in which diaspora have shaped what it is to be British, what it means to live here. One of my favourite art forms in the entire world is grime. It couldn't have come from anywhere apart from East London. And it itself was a hodgepodge between bits of UK hip hop, UK garage, and of course jungle and dancehall and all these forms of MCing shaped inherently by the colonial and the post-colonial experience. But because it's not draped in a Union Jack, because it's not making excuses for slavery and colonialism, because it's not falling at the feet of Winston Churchill, that's not seen as love for country. It's love for the wrong bit of the country, right? The brown bit, the black bit, the working class bit, and not for ruling class ideology. Here's the thing about Britain is that it's had a remarkably stable, consistent and resilient ruling class. We have had pretty much the same monarchy with a little hiccup in the Civil War for about 1,200 years. You have a hereditary aristocracy which still owns swathes of this country and has representation in our legislature in the form of the House of Lords. Because of that fact, I think we have got this idea of our history being the kind of reorganisation of chairs at the top of the dining club, rather than the heaves of history powered by working class struggle and working class resistance. Because it's not just Henry VIII, Queen Victoria and Winston Churchill, it's the Levellers, the Chartists, British Black Panthers, the Grunwick strike, the miners' strike, all of these things which went into shaping and making the partial democracy that we live in now. That story doesn't get told very often, because if you were to tell it too often, you would start asking uncomfortable questions about that ruling class, which hasn't changed all that much since William the Conqueror. I mean, this idea that all you need are brown faces and high places is just absolutely for the birds. Margaret Thatcher was this country's first female prime minister. She was the daughter of a grocer. Do you think she was good for women? Do you think she was good for working class people, or indeed, lower middle class people? No! So we should have learned this lesson a while ago, that just because somebody shares some of your identity attributes, it doesn't mean that they're going to be organising in your interests. Nobody is more interested in identity politics than black and brown Tories, because they will tell you the story of how their grandparents sailed here in a shoe with nothing but a halfpenny in their pocket, all the while deporting your grandparents. That's the game that they play. What they are a flimsy cover for the ongoing institutional racism of the state, just now with a little bit of diversity bunting at the top. The report into racial and ethnic disparities is a joke. It's the equivalent of getting a panel assembled by the CEOs of BP, Shell and ExxonMobil to write a report into how and why climate change is happening. It was biased from the start because Munira Mirza was behind it, who has made a career denying the existence of institutional racism and saying that it leads to a culture of grievance. It was chaired by Dr. Tony Sewell, who's been famous for the last decade, not only for saying much of the same thing, but that any enduring racial disparities can be put down to bad parenting and cultural failings, and also Mercy Muroki, who is at the improbably named Centre for Social Justice, a think tank set up by Ian Duncan Smith, no less. And you can most often find her in the pages of Rupert Murdoch's papers, reassuring its readership that this whole racism malarkey thing is overblown. So a government which doesn't like people talking about institutional racism assembled a panel of people who don't think institutional racism exists, and lo and behold, they've produced a report which says no institutional racism to be found here. Even for a report put together in bad faith, I was shocked and surprised that anybody who has a career in academia would be willing to put their name to such a sloppy piece of scholarship. People have been cited as stakeholders who've had no contact with the commission.
I never consented to it. I was never consulted about it. I had nothing to do with it.
There are real laugh out loud moments in the report as well, where they implore us to think about the bright side of slavery, where instead of focusing on the profit and exploitation of the slave trade, we look at it as an opportunity.
It's a cruise. I've never been on a big boat in the middle of the ocean before. Is it dangerous?
Absolutely not. In fact, we consider our customers precious cargo. So precious, in fact, we keep you safe and secure underneath the boat for the whole ride.
When it comes to the real purpose of the report, which is to explain away enduring racial disparities, they have to provide an alternative explanation. And the one that they go for is that ethnic minorities in this country are haunted by the memory of discrimination. And this haunting memory is kept alive by modern day anti-racists who are inculcating a culture of victimhood and grievance. This is saying, don't talk about the Bengal famine. Don't think too hard about the British Empire or of slavery. Don't think about your grandparents or your parents' experience in this country. Don't think too hard about post-colonial struggle for independence, which the British tried to stamp out.
We're going to be extremely firm and extremely mean. If anyone starts any trouble, they'll just get their head blown off. They'll get the message in time, you know.
So the model of Britishness that Tony Sewell and Mercy Muroki would have us embrace, it's a bit like that sketch in Goodness Gracious Me, where you've got the South Asian family trying to be more British than the British. It's a kind of British identity which doesn't even really exist for white British people in this country. It's a complete fiction, and it's all about pledging allegiance to these symbols of domination, exploitation, empire, rather than any kind of truly remodeled, outward-looking Britishness. Now, as for the institutional racism bit, whether it's the police or the healthcare system or our education system or housing, well, the evidence is pointing in one direction there. And within this context, where there's a lack of trust in shared institutions, a lack of trust in shared information, you can polarize and win over an increasingly reactionary and paranoid majority. So that is the point of this report. It's to give racists, in the words of Doreen Lawrence, the green light by handing them a battle standard with which to batter people of colour over the head and say, look, racism doesn't exist. And it's also about pumping out discredited, half-baked and shoddy scholarship, which means that all of us are stuck having a stupid argument about whether or not institutional racism exists, rather than the one that we should be having, which is how do we go about addressing it. Controversy was absolutely the point of this report, because you've got to ask yourself, why does the government like culture wars so much? A culture war is a political conflict which takes place on the terrain of identity. It's about who are we, how do we want people to see us, who are you, how do I see you? And it means that it's a fight which is never ever going to be resolved, because no one's identity is ever resolved. It can just keep going and going and going, and it turns our attention away from enduring material inequalities or problems with how our institutions are run or who's getting those lucrative government contracts. It is a masterclass in distraction. It's a never-ending vortex in which your energy gets sucked up, and you can't disengage from it, because that is unfortunately where politics is at the moment. But we believe in people power. We don't believe in governments producing reports which give us permission to be angry or permission to identify the social conditions that we live in. So as long as there are people, there's hope. You do have a country of changing demographics, of young people who have no buy-in to the system as it is, and people of colour who are politically and socially literate. That's some pretty good ingredients to work with if you want a people-powered movement. The problem with liberal identity politics is that it puts recognition from the state above self-organisation and above collective struggle and above solidarity. So if we want those ingredients to mean anything, in some ways we've got to divest ourselves of the desire to be recognised by those at the top and start recognising each other. If you liked this content, you should support Double Down News by finding their Patreon and giving them money. And if you didn't like this content, you should also go to their Patreon and give them money, because then they can fund a higher caliber